Mr. Lavrov, I want to ask you about Polina Zapadinskaya. She was in her final year of primary school. She was shot dead by the Russians as she was in her family car in Kyiv on Saturday. Mr. Lavrov, I know you have a daughter yourself. I want you to look me in the eye and just tell me, how do you sleep at night knowing that Russian bombs and bullets are killing children?
Могу сказать дополнительно к тому, что я уже сказал.
So what can I say in addition to what I've said already? Any human life is priceless. Any military actions are unfortunately connected to human loss, not just amongst the military personnel, but amongst the civilians. Our military personnel who are now involved in this special operation have a very strict order to only use high-precision military equipment to suppress the military infrastructure. Even the barracks where the Ukrainian army resides are not subject to any attacks. I can only express my condolences.
But you say Mr. Lavrov, you say high precision is used, but hundreds of civilians have reportedly already died. This is now being investigated by the International Criminal Court. I wonder if you personally are preparing your defense in a war crimes tribunal.
Понимаю ваше желание такие вот острые вопросы задавать. У вас будет аудитория.
I understand your desire to ask such heated questions as you want to emotionally charge your audience. This is your job, as far as I understand, to function as mass media, but rather as an instrument for hammering into people's head the information that is required by the Western leaders. I want to say once again, I am not justifying any action that leads to the death of civilians. But we were not the ones who came up with the expression of collateral damage. It was coined by our Western colleagues during their escapades in Iraq and previously in other countries, Latin America, Libya. Have you once used the same emotional charge covering the events in Iraq and Libya when there were hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties? I can't recall. So I see that your question is a rhetorical one.
Yes, absolutely, Mr. Lavrov, I have. But this is, you started this war. Polina's blood is on your hands, isn't it, Mr. Lavrov?
Понимаете, играть вот в эти игры, вы сейчас...
You are now playing a game and acting like a talk show host. If you want to know my personal opinion, I believe I have already expressed it very clearly, including the humanitarian aspects of the current operation. But I would really like you to, though I understand you will be covering it the way you're required to, but I really want you to bear in mind, and I hope that a journalist who is fulfilling a brief has a conscience, how you have conducted yourselves for the last 8 years, when girls just like that one, along with women and the elderly, were killed by thousands of mines in the Donbass. They were killed by the Ukrainian regime. Please visit the website of our ministry for more information, as I don't want to take up your time with long stories. If you are that concerned, as you are right to be, of the humanitarian consequence of any military operations, then God is willing for you to look at those pages which you have so far preferred not to touch on in your professional role.
We should go on the ground, we should announce there's going to be American casualties, we should go to Belgrade and we should have a Japanese, German-style occupation of that country, and we should have public trials in order to strike away this mask of this.
Radiation comes in other forms as well. Like during the 1991 Gulf War and the war in Kosovo, depleted uranium rounds were used again by the U.S. military, this time including the center of Baghdad. They lie around for anyone to see and touch. A Geiger counter will give a reading of between 5 and 15 pulses per minute in a typical environment. This depleted uranium round will trigger 10,000 pulses in about 40 seconds. This type of ammunition is radioactive because it is made of nuclear waste referred to as uranium-238 or depleted uranium. This material is left over from the processing of uranium-234 used for atomic bombs and uranium-235 used in nuclear power plants. Long considered toxic garbage, it found an extremely controversial application in the making of cheap, high-perforation shells. Uranium-238 remains radioactive for 4.5 billion years, and its toxicity reveals itself as soon as particles are inhaled or ingested. Cancer and birth defects are the most common side effects.
United States military forces used 320 tons of depleted uranium in the first Gulf War in 1991. The difference between the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War is very significant, and that is that in the second war, we have seen a lot more depleted uranium use in populated areas, in urban centers. American planes, A-10 Warthog planes that used DU rounds, the 30-millimeter DU rounds, fired at targets in cities.
These particular rounds were found inside the compound of one of Saddam Hussein's palaces in Baghdad. This compound is now guarded by American soldiers who are totally unaware of the contamination. Ironically, this particular palace was
Depleted uranium, also known as Q metal, D38, and DU, is a toxic and radioactive byproduct created in the production of enriched uranium for nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. It has a radioactive half-life of 4.4 billion years. The U.S. and NATO militaries began using bullets made of depleted uranium in 1991 in the Persian Gulf War, and they have continued using it in every major armed conflict since that time. DU is used because it is extremely dense, 1.6 times as dense as lead, which makes it ideal for piercing heavy armor. Just to give you an idea of how much this is being used, the U.S. fired 640,000 pounds of DU ammunition in the first Gulf War alone. In the initial 2003 invasion, they used an estimated 4 million pounds. When a depleted uranium shell hits its target, it explodes on impact, burning at extremely high temperatures, vaporizing into an ultrafine aerosol with a large percentage of the particles as small as 1/10 of a micron in size. To put that in perspective, these are literally as small as viruses. This depleted uranium dust spreads out into the atmosphere, where it finds its way into water and food supplies, and is inhaled by both soldiers and civilians living and moving throughout the area. Studies have shown that upon inhalation, these particles are small enough to pass through the nose, through the olfactory nerves, and into the brain, where it accumulates. Depleted uranium also accumulates in the bones and teeth due to the fact that the body replaces calcium with it. Governments that use DU always like to portray it as safe by referring to how solid chunks don't emit enough radiation to be harmful from a distance. But this defense fails to account for the fact that these microscopic radioactive particles, once absorbed into tissues, are in direct contact with cells throughout the body. And once it's in the body, there is no way to remove it, nor can these microscopic particles be removed from the environment at large. And remember, depleted uranium remains radioactive for over 4.4 billion years. One of the hidden tragedies of the Iraq wars has been the marked increase in birth defects, nervous system anomalies, and cancer rates. In some areas, birth defect rates have been shown to have increased by 15 times what they were before the war. It's also worth noting that after the Gulf War, thousands of soldiers became chronically ill and have never recovered. This condition is officially called Gulf War syndrome. The U.S. government denies that this illness has any connection with DU, even though soldiers far from the front lines have been found to have large quantities of these radioactive particles in their system. Now, given these facts, you would think that countries that claim to care about human rights would condemn the use of depleted uranium weaponry. However, there have been multiple attempts to impose a moratorium on its use over the years, but France, Britain, the US, and Israel have consistently blocked such proposals. The next time you hear one of these governments or the mainstream media of one of these countries talking about chemical or nuclear weapons that some country may have or be planning to build, keep that in mind. So what do you think? Agree or disagree, put your 2 cents in the comments, or call in to discuss it live on our Monday and Wednesday night roundtable at 10 p.m. Eastern. Also, be sure to let us know in the comments if there's...
Dr. Doug Rocky is a U.S. Army Health Physicist and Nuclear Medical Sciences Officer. Dr. Rocky has expertise in nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare operations, microwave radiation, emergency response, decontamination, and battlefield cleanup.
We were the super garbage men. We had to clean up the messes. We had to identify the messes. We had to collect all the garbage. We had to provide the on-site medical care. It's a lot. All the Iraqi equipment, a lot of U.S. equipment, contains radiological components. When that equipment was blowing up, the radiological materials were released into the environment, exposing and contaminating. And then to top it all off, we used uranium emissions, known as depleted uranium. They've been used back in 1973 by the Israelis against the Egyptians, but during Gulf War I, Desert Shield and Desert Storm, we took it to a totally new level. The use of radioactive materials on the battlefield. Deliberately taken tons and tons, actually over 350 tons of solid radioactive materials, and dispersed it across Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. taking our radioactive waste and throw it in somebody else's backyard. I am considered a disabled veteran. I got a 40% disability from the United States Department of Veteran Affairs for combat injuries caused by depleted uranium and other exposures. We had the warnings. We also had the responsibility to put together all the decontamination guidelines and also what's called the Combat Lifesaver Program. So myself and my team wrote that, which has now been adopted by the Army and is used every day by the Army.
Battlefields and fighting are by nature hazardous to your health. Some hazards are easy to identify and well understood. Soldiers recognize the serious hazards presented by incoming artillery shells and bullets and take appropriate actions. However, some lesser hazards from new technological applications are not so well known and recognized. One of these newer applications is the use of depleted uranium in munitions and equipment armor. Depleted uranium is obtained from uranium ore, which is found throughout the world. In the United States, this ore is mined in New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and Arizona. Uranium ore contains 3 isotopes. By weight, 99.28%, which is uranium-238, 0.71%, which is uranium-235, and 0.0058%, which is uranium-234.
Aluminum model of 1 DU tank round. This round would be fired by an Abrams tank. If it was actually uranium rather than aluminum, it would be over 10 pounds of solid uranium. What happens, it moves extremely high velocity. The minute it leaves the bore of the gun, it catches fire. So this rod is a burning rod of uranium. It impacts tremendous forces, unbelievable forces, over this very small diameter. And it's like a blowtorch with tremendous forces that punches right through. Now, as this breaks through and goes into anything, it can be steel, concrete, sandbag bunkers, wood, or anything. Uranium itself is soft. So you have parts of the fragments of uranium breaks off as it enters and goes through. The uranium rod emits alpha, beta, and gamma radiation and X-ray radiation. The alpha particle is a 4.15 MeV particle. That's 4.15 million electron volts. Now, the intercellular voltage, the voltage that your cell operates biologically, is 10 electron volts. So when that cell is bombarded by an alpha particle at 4.5 million electron volts, it doesn't have a good day. We have all kinds of other problems. We have the beta particle and the gamma rays, the X-rays. Now, we've actually measured the ionizing radiation emissions from a DU rod within, say, 4 to 6 inches at over 300 millirems per hour. Now, that radiation is continuous. So you get a fragment of DU into your body that's emitting at over 300 millirems per hour. Or if you're holding the rod in your hand, it's over 300 millirems per hour. And if you got the fragment, then you got the alpha particle in there, which is an extremely hot particle, 4.15 MeV. And we're looking at what we measured over 10,000 counts per minute, 10,000 disintegrations per minute, 10,000 alpha particles per minute. In fact, in May of 2002, the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs reported that over 160,000 troops that participated in Gulf War I, the period August of 1990 through the fall of 1991, basically October and November 1991, have been classified as disabled from anywhere from 10 to 100%. Now, my own disability didn't come about until after May of 2002. The count right now is somewhere close to 200,000. In December of 1992, the director of the United States Army Environmental Policy Institute was ordered to figure out ways to reduce the toxicity of uranium emissions by Assistant Secretary of the Army Walker. In 1995, the director of AEPI told the Secretary of the Army, we can't reduce the toxicity. It's not possible. The United States Army Common Task Training states very specifically, uranium contamination will make food and water unusable. And yet we use it in combat. all over the place. That's why the United Nations Subcommission on Human Rights had ruled that uranium munitions were an illegal weapon, because they're indiscriminate. They can't be cleaned up, and they last for eternity.
We have found that wrongs were indeed committed, both with experiments involving radiation and with intentional releases of radiation into the environment. In the pursuit of peace and the advancement of medicine, certainly two laudable goals, the rights and interests of individuals and communities were sometimes ignored. We found that government officials and physicians who had the trust of the public and of their patients abused that trust. Patients were used as subjects of experiments without their knowledge or consent. Information was withheld from affected communities and from the public. Secrets were kept to protect the government from embarrassment and legal liability. While the radiation doses in the experiments we studied were usually low, and officials and scientists were often concerned about risk, we do not believe that excuses the wrongs that were done. We urge you to do the right thing by those who have been wronged or harmed by these events. In our report, we recommend for your consideration guidelines for compensating former subjects. But if we are to keep faith with those who have suffered, we must all do more. Your extraordinary efforts have allowed the American people to learn about a piece of our history that we could not otherwise have understood. You have opened the doors of this nation's records, and they must stay open. You have recognized the price of secrecy in research for what it is, a legacy of cynicism and a legacy of distrust. If we are to keep faith with those who have suffered, we must do everything possible to guarantee that what happened to them never happens again. The committee learned that research safeguards have come a long way since the Second World War. Americans can and should feel much more secure about medical research today, but the system remains imperfect. I urge you to carefully review the committee's findings and recommendations. Both the government and research institutions must do all they can to protect our fellow citizens. If this committee's work is to mean anything, it has to be that 50 years from now, there does not have to be another presidential committee charged with investigating allegations of abuses of human subjects. There should never be another such advisory committee. Information must not be concealed again from people in their own time, so that it takes 2 generations for the truth to come out. Mr. President, your leadership in this area has been indispensable. Without your willingness to open government files to our scrutiny, our work would have been totally impossible. We could not have done it. Your staff, your cabinet and agency heads and their staffs have been supportive at every